Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, at least in this part of the world. I'm Kathy Leach on behalf of the International Montessori Council and Montessori Foundation. I'll be your host today for today's very important webcast conversation. And I'd like to introduce our panel today. We have people on camera and we have panelists off camera. So I'll try to get everybody included here. I'm joined by Senior Consultant with the Montessori Foundation and IMC Board Member Jonathan Wolf. Thanks for being here today. Tanya Reiskin is here with us, Associate Head of School at our lab school, the Newgate School, also very involved in our consulting with the foundation and with IMC. Also very good friend of the IMC, Montessori Foundation. We have Dr. Cindy Acker, Christina Torres, and Dr. Valida Weiss. They will all be participating in this conversation. Additionally, I have on our panel Viju Kadabi, who is not visible right now, but I think that we're going to invite her at some point. We also have Markham, Lowry, and I think we'll be joined shortly by Andrew Shutt, also an IMC board member. Hearing a bit of an echo. Sure where that's coming from. That could, yeah, we may have to have a panelist mute for a moment. Okay, sounds better now. So as we change the topic of this week's webcast in order to respond to the current events, we called out to some of our closest allies and friends and looked at what was the best way for us to move forward, and we felt like this was the first format that we would use for this conversation. The title today is The Role We Play in Systemic and Internal Racism. What questions should we ask ourselves? So is everybody else here still hearing the echo?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Any thoughts on that? Help me understand why we've never. Sometimes we have audio problems, but I haven't had.
Let me mute everyone, and then we'll just start unmuting. Kathy, you're unmuted now. George unmuted.
Okay, let's try that now. Can you hear me now better? Oh, a little better. Thank you, Tim, for your tricks. Always appreciate that. We wanted to start with a moment of silence, but that wasn't quite what we had in mind. So I would like to introduce that we all do take a moment of silence and reflection in honor of why we're here today and what has brought us all together for this conversation.
I am worthy. I am worthy. I am worthy. I am worthy.
Thank you.
Cindy.
It is from numberless diverse acts of courage and belief that human history is shaped. Each time a man stands up for an ideal, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope. And crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, those ripples build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and justice.
Thank you.
Beautiful, Cindy. Before you get going, may I suggest that all of us who are panelists mute ourselves? That's what's causing the echoing.
So it should be okay if you're on camera, but I think if we're not specifically talking, it's probably a good idea to mute. But I think that ended it. So whatever that last muting was did help. So I would like to just open with our panel giving a few words about why you're here today. We know why we're all here, but just in general, what called you to participate with us in this conversation and on this journey that we know that doesn't have an end date. It's we're not coming in at the beginning of the journey. We're coming in 400 years into the journey. And I think it's appropriate to recognize that.
Shall I start?
Please, Cindy.
My ancestors come from the Mende tribe. And so I'm a descendant of the Mende tribe. And the Mende tribe were a group of slaves who were the only group of slaves who fought their way back legally through the court system to have the right to return to Africa. And so I think that way embedded in my bones has always been a fight for social justice and for the rights of others. And I'm woke is the expression that we use to what has been going on in our nation for the time that since the time that we got here and individuals took the land from our Native American brothers. And ever since then, there has been a power and otherness that has been a perpetuation in this nation. And so it's not new for me. And the situations that have happened this past week with people that we have heard about, including Mr. Floyd, and I want to say Mr. just to give him respect, is one of many. And I am constantly aware of the fact that we need to look at our structures, we need to look at ourselves, and we need to look at the communities in which we are in and that we represent, that we need to not allow anyone to not be on their trajectory course of trying to become anti-racist, because we send out teachers into classrooms, we send out people into public policy, we send out our children into the street, and we need to know that we're doing our work to change the hard course of what's been going on in America.
Thank you, Cindy. Oh, you're muted, Val. Oh, you can't unmute. Well, that's not so good. Let's see. I think we can do that right here. Okay, go ahead. It says you're unmuted.
There you go. Okay. So thank you, Cindy, for sharing that. That was so inspiring. First, your song was inspiring, but the quote that you read, and the fact that, like you, I'm a descendant of slaves. Unlike you, I have no idea of where that background comes from. It's too lost. But I'm dedicated to and believe in the power of Montessori to make change. And that I believe that we have a responsibility as Montessorians to own that, and in whatever way that is. And so for years, since the early 90s, I have been working on and thinking about the social justice work that has to be part of Montessori. And that the responsibility for us is that if we're not actively working on dismantling racism and systemic oppression, then our silence reverberates, and it speaks volumes about who we are. But I know that we have a pathway forward, and that I want to be part of that pathway. And I think the discussion and conversation start now. All of us have a responsibility to this, and all of us have a part to play that will be so powerful in union with all of us. So I look forward to hearing how we can all do this together and how we can make a difference for not just the children in our schools, but for the children of the planet. I have 3 amazing children who all went through Montessori and will have children of their own one day. I want Montessori to be there for them, and the kind of Montessori that we can be proud of, so that Black and brown children across the planet, who are the majority, the global majority, have something to call their own, and that will unlock their human potential.
Thank you, Val.
So, can you hear me? Nope, I'm muted.
Nope, we can hear
Oh,
you.
you can hear me? Okay, yay. So, I similarly, I think that race and racism has been a conversation or an existence in my ancestors and in my life pre me being born, and then was something that I grew up with. So I come, it's really funny, that question of what are you has been something that I have experienced throughout my life. And I have, my family comes from Puerto Rico as well as Greece, fairly recently to the United States. And Taino, so from our Puerto Rican side, I have great grandmothers that's a Taino and African American. My family, this question of who are we? What is our relationship to each other when we're coming from different sides, either forced coming together or unforced, forced decisions to leave our land or doing so through lack of a choice has just been something as a part of, conversation. And it really wasn't until later in my life through college and graduate school where I was doing work in diversity and equity and disability studies and looking at race and gender that I had access to a language and a framework for understanding my own identity and history, and as well as a greater what's happening in the world around me. And that's something that really started me down a path of how does education and access to thinking and language influence and change society. And why I love Montessori is because I feel that that is embedded in the philosophy and the principles. And because if we are lifelong learners, if we are meeting people to listen, to observe, to step back and see all the ways that things are interconnected, that we are creating a system and a society that has equity. And so, and that was something that was a center of, as a head of school, that was the center of our practice as a school of being, what does a school look like that's truly diverse, ethnically, racially, religiously, socioeconomically, and have a social justice framework. So.
Thank you, Stina. John or Viju?
Go ahead, Viju.
Can you hear me?
Oh, now we can,
Can
yes.
everybody hear me? Okay. I'm Baiju, and I have a very different reason that I'm coming. First of all, thank you, Cindy and Belita, for sharing your stories, because I think for years I've had my eyes closed, and I want to honor your journeys. I am also a person of color. I'm a very privileged person of color. I come from families where college education was just the norm. We were definitely the privileged people leaving India, so I'm not even sure that I have the right to speak in this forum. I'll be that honest with you. Have I experienced some discrimination? Sure, but as I read and as I'm learning how misinformed I've been through my own history books, through my own schooling, my eyes are getting opened, and I really see the privilege that I've been afforded. And I honor your stories, and I'm here to listen and learn.
Thank you, Baiju. Although I've not been a recipient of racism, I come from a background of Holocaust victims and survivors. But I find that I've reached a point now where the discrepancy between what we can be as a humanity and what we are and can be as a nation and what we are not manifesting has just become really painful for me to watch. As some of you know, a lot of my consulting work is pointing out to adults that, like, well, if children in a Montessori classroom do this, why don't you adults behave that way in the school? And the discrepancy in our society between our potential as humanity and our potential as a nation, and how so many people have been disenfranchised and continue to be, is just, it's hard for me to watch. I've got to be more involved. So I am also, like Baiju, here to learn, but I want to be involved.
Thank you, John. I have a couple other panelists who may, aren't on camera, but I introduced, and if any of you would like to speak, I believe that you are all unmuted, and feel free if you have something you'd like to add before we get into everything else. Okay. We had several people thanking you, Cindy, for the beautiful song and asking about the quote. And so I have posted the quote in the question box, so people will have that. Was Robert Kennedy who was quoted. So I want to just make sure we give that out for everyone. And I think that, I speak for all of our panelists. We're here because we're grieving. And I know for me as a mother, my heart breaks that certain people are in our culture are targeted, and that I couldn't imagine one of my sons walking out into the street and being murdered, or jogging, or being in bed, or any of the other things that have happened that we don't see. We only see what the cameras are allowing us to see, and that's fairly recent. And so, I think that we have to honor that it's happening far more than many of us know or realize, and that human rights are everybody's business. This is work for all of us. So thanks for those of you who have logged on today, and we want to remind you that we always like to have participants involved in what's happening, even though we can't see each other. We would love for you to put your questions and comments into the question box on the control panel, which is on the right side of your screen, on most people's screen. I'll be monitoring those as we go. We've had some people asking me to list the panelists, so yes, I will put everyone's name in the box, so you'll see that. I'll get to that. And I also will, like I said, be monitoring questions and comments that come in. I also would like to let everyone know and invite you to a town hall. We do a town hall every Friday that was very much devoted to processing COVID-19. And we will be dedicating, for the foreseeable future, we're not giving up our COVID work at all. These things work can happen simultaneously and has to. And so our town hall will be devoted to continuing this conversation and for all of us moving into a position of not just conversations, but of making decisions and taking actions, both for ourselves internally, but also for our schools, our communities, our organizations. So it's big work. I take a lot of deep breaths, and I honor the people who've been doing this work long before any of us, or I won't mean anybody on the panel, because you have been before any of us internally in IMC have been doing it. We have been devoted. We had 2 years ago put this as a strategic initiative for us to learn more about this. We've done some of that. We have far more work to do. And I'm here to tell you that we are dedicated and committed to doing that with the help that we so desperately need to learn from the resources and those kinds of things. Cindy has shared a list of books with us. I will be posting those as well as we get the conversation going. But I'd like to really start this conversation around the inner work that each of us has to do. Because there's big work that we have to do, throughout our country, our nation, that we have to do in our organizations, but we can't move in that direction until we've each done our internal work. And so I'd like to start there. And I know Cindy and Val, you spent a lot of time with me yesterday. I appreciate that, and helping to look at framing this particular conversation. And so I'd like to have you, if you would mind, sort of leading that inquiry into the internal process.
Please, Cindy, I'll start. I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, I don't think you're muted.
There. I did a lot of research on people and their ideologies and mental models. It's how we frame things in our mind that comes from who we are, who our parents were, who our environment was, and how it shaped us. And from that, because we're human, we create something that drives us, that moves how we see the world. And so part of the work, I think, in a lot of people who have been upset and who have been looting and things like that, that some of society is missing, is that there is definitely systemic racism, but there's what is it internal. And I want to read you something that came from a doctor, and it's in the New Orleans Journal of Medicine, dated 1851. And he says, according to unalterable physiological laws, Negroes, as a general rule, to which there are but few exceptions, can only have their intellectual faculties awakened in a sufficient degree to receive moral culture and to profit by religious instruction, or under compulsory authority of a white man. Their natural indolence, unless under the stimulus of compulsion, they doze away their lives with the capacity of their lungs for atmospheric air only half expanded from the want of exercise. The black blood distributed to the brain chains the mind to ignorance, superstition, and barbarism, and bolts the door against civilization, moral culture, and religious truth. So this isn't the Journal of Medicine back in the 1800s. And I cannot tell you how much that particular document shaped a lot of things that were going on and exacerbated people's beliefs about people who were slaves at the time, Blacks who came from Africa. And that kind of information is what creates some of the belief systems that people have, where we other people. And at that time, Blacks were considered so othered that they were put in the category of almost animals, which is what this doctor is perpetuating. And you can do things to animals in the minds of many humans that you would not do to human beings. And so knowing that that has come from so long ago, and those kinds of belief systems have been embedded in the DNA and the practices and the ideologies and the mental models of people, they have framed what we do and how we think over the course of time. And unless we do that work, and that's Black and brown and white people, everybody, unless we do that work to look at where our thoughts and ideas come from, because there's a lot of judgment that is in the human nature. And unless we check that, unless we constantly check ourselves around that, it's what gives rise to many other things. And what we have seen nationally is a rise to what was covert to overt racism that has allowed many more things to occur that might have been kept under wraps for a much longer period of time. But it starts with us being able to do our work. We can't go out there and raise our sign and walk the streets and saying that we're going to take care of systemic racism when we haven't dealt with our internal lack of racial consciousness.
And Cindy, you said that so well. Can you hear me? Thumbs up if you can hear. Okay, you said that so well. I think what you're also kind of getting to is this natural tendency for the brain to devolve into prejudice. Our brains are wired for prejudice, and prejudice in many ways is a good thing. The fact that you won't eat things that are poisonous is part of prejudice. The fact that you understand the difference between a table and a chair is a function of your brain understanding prejudice and putting things in categories. Where it runs amok is when you start associating bad motives to individuals because of that prejudice. So anti-bias work, that's the eternal work that we all need to do. So it is not just the purview of white America that is biased. We're all biased. The challenge is that when there's a culture, a white supremacy culture, that has allowed a specific kind of prejudice to happen to a complete people, a people of color, this is when it's all gone wrong. So the internal work also that we have to do is find out what is our real underlying prejudice that we have. What is our bias? Most of the time, it is not a racist bias. It is the fact that you don't get that you are walking across the street when a man of color with a hoodie on is walking by you, that you don't necessarily would go to a Black restaurant or a restaurant owned by a person of color or a store. These are these little subtle underlying things that show that we have been affected by all of the negativity that's in our media, that's in our reading. So exposing yourself, coming out of your comfort zone. I talk to many schools and they'll say, and when I do my DEIJ work, they'll say, well, you know, Val, there are no people of color in my community. I get it. You know, I totally get it. The fact is you have to push yourself out there and find those people of color. Have friends. When you do a list of who are your closest people, the people you trust, make that mental list, pretend, get on a piece of paper right now and do about 6 people. How many of them are really different from you? How many of them are from a different race or a different religion? Have you gone outside of your bubble of individuals where you really feel, what did you read lately? Have you read anything by Ta-Nehisi Coates? Do you get it? Have you discussed it with your friends? So that's spiritual work. Have you looked at Dr. Montessori's work and understood what she's saying about the spiritual preparation of the teacher? And I love John always connects this. I'm hoping he'll kind of piggyback on what I'm saying. He always connects this so beautifully about that preparation. And you know, Dr. Montessori, God love her, was working in a very closed system herself. But the reality is the principles are there for us to understand and be able to use, that we have to kind of broaden our sphere and not be afraid to lean in. The other part of it is, I think I started out by saying that silence is an action. And one way that we perpetuate this system that we have is by being silent. So the other preparation we need to make is the preparation of bravery. I have a very dear friend who I love, who I think is passionate about DEIJ work. And when this all started, she called me and she said, Val, I'm part of a big organization. I'm in the leadership. What should we do? Our leadership has not taken any stand. It's not written a letter. It hasn't done anything. I said, well, you write the letter. She said, but people will look at me strange. They may ostracize me. Well, that's where the bravery comes in. That's where you have to step out and lean into the pain of all of this. We need allies. You need to spiritually prepare yourself to be that ally, to go where it's uncomfortable, to say the things that people are going to look at you and say, I don't know. If we had that, if we had people who would say and write and do the things that are uncomfortable for them, African Americans have been doing it for years. I wake up every day and I have to be in that powerful, painful position of saying, I'm the first Black woman to do so and so. Cindy's done it all the time. Tina's done it all the time. I'm the first person of color to do this. I'm the first woman to do this. Lean into that position. Be the one to say, this is not right, but also know why. So have you looked at the history of why all of this is occurring? I'm sorry to go on so long, Kathy, but there's a really great example. People will say, but I don't understand how this systematic racism that Cindy talked about. So, well, how did this happen? I mean, we've got these great laws. The challenge is that if you create a policy or a law, or you're doing something in your school and you haven't asked or looked at how it's affecting people of color or marginalized groups, you are perpetuating the white supremacist culture, this idea of this racism that's been going on because you haven't asked the question. I'll give you a great example. The GI Bill, beautiful bill, right? It was probably one of the most forward-thinking social bills of our country. And if you don't know what the GI Bill, do some quick history on it, but the GI Bill was about giving education to those folks coming back from World War II, that they were given these great loans, that they were able to go to college, and that sounds fantastic. It was going to catapult a whole country who were a bunch of individuals who were lower class to middle class. And it worked for lots of people. It did not work for people of color, because they didn't look at the extenuating circumstance, recognizing that you give them the bill, but if the banks won't give people of color a loan, then it doesn't change anything. In fact, it perpetuates it and makes it worse, because now you've catapulted a whole section, and the other one is kept down, even though they gave blood, sweat, and tears. They were in the war, but you're saying that they can't access it. And banks were not held accountable. Is that happening within our own organizations? Is that happening within our schools? Are we saying that this works for everyone and not recognizing that it's not working for everyone because we never asked a question? There was a public Montessori instructor that I talked with once, and public Montessori instructor who I spoke with once. And she said, Val, I'm really wondering, white woman, she says, I'm really wondering about this whole idea of normalization and African-American boys. Do we need to question whether normalization looks the same for everyone? I was like, that's a great question. Let's collect the data and see. Are you looking at the data? Are you asking the questions? Data drives this. It helps us to understand what's really happening instead of assuming that it's working for everyone. Let's make sure that it is. Sorry, Kathy. I shall get off the box.
Please don't be sorry. This is why we've invited you here. We want your voice and your experience and your stories. And I think that, a lot of what informs us are the stories. And so I know that both you and Cindy have some stories that are important to share, and I'm sure other panelists do as well, but we specifically need the very clear stories that articulate what we're trying to talk about today. Cindy, there was a story. Oh, John, go ahead. And then I know, Cindy, there was a story you told me yesterday that we need to talk about.
Yeah. Well, Cindy and Val, I want to thank you for beginning with the inner work, the spiritual work, that spiritual preparation. One of my favorite of Montessori's phrases, I think this is what Val was referring to, is the teacher or parent or school leader must purify her heart.
That's the one.
Render it burning with charity towards the child. Mm-hmm. How the heck can you be absurd? How can you understand the needs of another human being or a group of human beings if you haven't purify the impurities, the negativity, the mental models, as Cindy said, the negative mindsets, the constricting mindsets in our own hearts and minds. It's got to be the inner work first. So I want to thank both of you for starting us on that journey, because that's, as Montessori said, that's the hardest work and that's the real work. And systems and culture won't change until we do that, until we turn the mirror around and do that for ourselves. So I want to thank both of you.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think too, John, one of the things that Montessori was alluding to, and that we all know is part of this, is that this is not a one-shot deal. We don't just, we say, okay, our hearts are clear, we're good.
Yep.
The reality is that there are these forces that continue to push us and direct us, and they're powerful forces into making it so that even African Americans believe that they are lesser than.
Yeah.
That Latino Americans and Latinx believe that because they are here in America, they must lose their language and lose their names. That is still going on. Yeah. That they have to live in fear. That these are the parts of things. So that's a continual work. We have to all go back to and touch the stone and say, excuse me, and look at the mirror. Am I still where I'm supposed to be? Is that guide star still out there for me?
Yeah, it's an ongoing process of mindfulness. What am I thinking now, and is that really in tune?
Yeah. Thank you. Stina, go ahead. I think you and Baiju were both shaking your heads like you had a point, so I'd like to include you. Go ahead, Christina.
Thank you. I was just going to share that I think that it's important, and I say this personally as somebody who has been in the middle, right? I had this conversation once with Val, how it took me years to understand and claim that identity of what it means to be in the middle, where I pass in certain circles. And so people say things around me that they would not say if there were people who did not look like them. And in those spaces, it is very important that I show up and I disrupt. And but that process for me was a process of learning how to do that, right? So I think that one of the most powerful things for me when I was a head of school was that we were engaging our children in learning that language at such a young age of how to have conversations about race, about how difference, and their parents. We were having these conversations. We were looking in our community for these ways that of where racism, systemic racism is present and where we're assuming certain things. And so you can't, the education is ongoing and constant. I always assume that I don't know enough and that I'm going to make mistakes. Part of that, though, is, whatever, or the not enough. Like, that's a voice that we carry sometimes when we're not seen as belonging. And so it's important to know that for children who are carrying that voice, the not enough voice shows up in different ways, in behavior, in language. It is complex, and the best thing we can do as adults is educate ourselves and continuously educate ourselves and push our comfort zone and be willing to investigate, where do these structures of power and privilege, are they showing up for me? I am very well aware of my power and my privilege. I'm constantly thinking of those things in a way of then how do I operate so that I can really work towards the social justice and these values that I hold. It's something that I have to recognize. So you view yourself as, we're all multiplicity, right? We all have multiple identities. We have to look at our whole self and recognize them and question and say, when I was exploring my biases, I realized I was like, oh, I kind of have a bias against rich people. That's not, I was horrified. I was like, that's awful. It's not, so where am I coming up with this? Okay, let me really peel back all the layers of where am I coming up with this. When I was listing my closest friends, I realized I really didn't have that many white men. I was like, oh, huh, that's interesting. So doing that work, you kind of have to face, like, hold up the mirror to yourself and face this inner work, so then you see how that's affecting you in your outer world. Where is this impacting how I'm interacting with people, how I'm viewing spaces? Am I crossing the sidewalk, or am I not going to this fair because I feel like, oh, I can't go there because it's people that look differently than me? That's
Mm.
not, am I not taking my children? This happens now where we're living, where some people say they don't take their kids to Chicago. I'm like, what do you mean you don't take them to Chicago? I can't imagine living in Chicago and not going all over in Chicago. So these are examples of ways of thinking that sometimes we don't realize we're teaching our children racism.
Can I just piggyback on that, Christina, because you just laid out some really important things to help change that spiritual work that Jonathan was talking about, some practical examples. First, you stopped and you said, let me list down what I'm thinking and where is this coming from? You listed your friends, you realized, wait a minute. So you thought about it, you stopped, and then you reprimed. You reprimed yourself. So you said, well, how can I change this? I need to expand my friend network. And then you went to remove it by applying and going to do that thing. So the bad news is we're all under this implicit bias as our brains work. They often don't align with our said perspective. We say one thing and our implicit bias takes us somewhere else. And it's not our declared belief, but it will also predict how we act. So that's why it was so important for you to root it out. But you took the steps to do it, and it was powerful. Mine is a Southern accent. God knows. I evaluate teachers all the time. It's what I do. And I walk into a classroom in the deep South, and I'm like, and I have to reprime myself. Get over it, stop it, and listen to what they're doing and watch them. But I have to do that every single time. I'm beginning to get better at it, but the reality is it's part of how my brain kind of functions, and I have to be aware of it.
Thanks, Val. And Sina, I'd like to read a couple of comments. First of all, I'd like to welcome Kathy Minardi, who is here and is not on our panel, but has agreed to be on our task force. And we honor the work that she has done and is continuing to do in this area. Kathy says, we also need to realize that radicalized trauma is deep in our bodies somatically and impacts each of us.
Yes.
Yeah.
Ooh,
and I know
that is so powerful. I was just on a call with two individuals. I'm at Johns Hopkins as a faculty member, and racialized trauma, her name is Norma Devine. She's done incredible work on broaching. We just wrote an article for NAIS about the implications of using broaching within schools. But we presented it at one of the national conferences as well. But she talks about the fact that racialized trauma makes you sick. So when we think about the health implications of racialized trauma, and you wonder, well, why are African Americans always the ones who have all these? It's because racialized trauma has been passed down for generations, and it's making us sick. So what a great point. Thank you, Kathy.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that. And we have several people asking for, where to find things, resources. I have posted Cindy's list in the chat box, but other people are posting resources as well. So thank you for that. If you have resources, of course, please share. And I'm copying and pasting them now so we can put together a comprehensive list of everyone's
Excellent.
Everyone's thoughts here. And someone asked earlier, I want to go back to this. How do we address Dr. Montessori's own prejudices?
Mm-hmm.
I think we address them.
Exactly.
Everybody else is, except.
Thank you. Whoever brought that up, I want to thank you because, holding Montessori up as some kind of an otherworldly deity who wasn't a human being with issues of her own is just BS. It's like I once heard years ago Ram Dass, who's recently passed on, say, the trouble with you Americans is that you worship the teacher and not the teachings. It's like, let's get over our worship of Maria Montessori. She was a genius. She created this incredible model that has been a lifestyle for all of us. But she also had cultural blinders and biases like everyone else. So let's, as Christina just said, let's just call it for what it is. It's not about worshiping Maria Montessori. It's about doing our work that then affects the outer society.
And I think along those lines, then we have an opportunity to look where are we repeating that, right? So this is, I often hear, oh, well, we want more people, we want more diversity in our teachers. Or again, so I was leading a school in the Caribbean in St. Croix. And there are, well, first let me call out that the U.S. Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, Guam, American Samoa, we are owned by the United States. Okay, so we are still owned. There's 4 million citizens who cannot vote for any, we don't have voting representation. So, and now, thank you, Hamilton, who grew up on St. Croix, but everybody knows about Puerto Rico. So there's more consciousness, but for our lighter, look, my family's from Puerto Rico, from the lighter people. So we really have to ask ourselves, where are these things showing up? So in our Montessori classroom, my children, they're not mine. No minute. Our community does not look like most of the resources that come from North American Montessori. So we were very intentional of making sure that we had resources that were appropriate for everybody. And I see that too often. I walk into a Montessori classroom, there's only European art. It's a small thing, but it's not small. There's, the only songs that are sung are Christian. The only books are from, North America, or we say, this is my favorite one, where, well, literature has been around for years. Let's remember that there's a time in our history where a Black person could be killed for reading and writing. That impacts, if you're looking at literature as only being what has been passed down generationally, there's a context to that. So we have to really be able to have those conversations and accept when we hear it that it may make you uncomfortable, but now how do we move past that and make our Montessori environments inclusive?
I think you were going to say something.
I'm sorry, who?
Yeah, I was just going to say what I'm hearing from all of you, and tell me if I'm wrong, is as Montessorians, sometimes we hide behind grace and courtesy. Not have that difficult conversation. And
I resemble that one.
So we don't get to being brave because of, oh, that's not the nice thing to do, and I could hurt somebody's feelings, or what about that donor over there? I could offend that donor, I could offend that board member, and especially those people who have power, we're really afraid of offending, and their financial power. Okay, let's just remember that money is a huge source of power, and how do we then? Right? Because that has not been equal access. And how do we disrupt that without hiding behind grace? We're still being respectful. I'm not saying we have to stop being respectful. It's such a fine line, I think. And it's so easy to go back to grace and courtesy. So, oh yeah, that'll be my shield from everything else.
Doesn't that come down again to the introspective work that we're talking about? It's like, am I afraid of confrontation? Am I afraid of asking difficult questions to disrupt the status quo of thinking? My take on a lot of us Montessorians, and I'll turn the finger on myself, is I think I can sense other people's energies, but getting in somebody's face and going, Val, I think we have a difference of opinion here. I don't like to do that.
It's
I think
uncomfortable.
part of the inner work that we're talking about is don't avoid difficult conversations about race or inequity. Get in there.
But I also think, John, and to kind of piggyback, Raju, on your statement, the feedback is making me confused about what I'm saying. But anyway, I'm trying. Is that we also believe that there's this kind of underlying belief in Montessori that we're colorblind. And the challenge with colorblindness means that you are discounting everyone's experience. as much as it seems like it's a good thing to be, that I don't see race. The reality is race is part of who I am. And it's like saying you don't see my name. So being color brave is where we really should be. So that we're interested in asking, Vaju, tell me about your culture and what I should know and how I should interact and what are the things that I should understand about it. And let's go out and talk about this and let's celebrate our differences so I can learn from yours and really get what it means to walk in your perspective.
Can we ask people to mute once more, Kathy?
Yeah, I'm trying to do it from here and I'm not having any luck. But yeah, if we can, all the other participants are muted, all the other panelists are muted. So I will mute. Cindy, do you want to add to what Val was just saying?
I wanted to add in general, and I want to push back just a little bit. I think that part of the challenge is that people have not known what they haven't known. And as associations across the world, we have put teachers out into classrooms who have not been race conscious. And they have their pedagogical information and their academic information, and they walk into classrooms and they harm children. And I hate to say it that way, but they harm each other when we don't recognize each other. And it's not about it's not just about what art you have and what food you have and what language you speak, or just asking you what your race is. It's about recognizing that you may not know all of the cultures of the children in your environment. And in this day and age, they may not know either. We have browning children who may be comprised of many different races and cultures, and we may not know. We also may not understand what their cultural practices are in their house that are connected to their race or their culture. And that we walk in a colonial fashion and we give them the presentation of how this is supposed to be, when we've completely disrupted what is natural to them, and we have discarded it and said this is wrong. I had a student, Merci Moyo, who was adopted from Nigeria, and her very first day in the classroom, she put the tray on her head and she walked across the classroom with the tray on her head, and the teacher immediately went over to correct her and to very nicely show her how we hold a tray. And I backed the teacher up and I said, don't make that wrong, because for her that is not wrong. That's what she knows, that's what she has seen. And so the teacher said, well, what are we going to do if we have a bunch of children who are walking around with trays on their head? And I said, well, they'll end up with a practice and they'll learn about gravity, and they'll learn about how to walk the line without knowing that there's even a line to walk. And they'll learn about culture and somebody else's practice, but we don't undo that. And very often, children of color particularly come with things that they are familiar with, or that is embedded as a part of who they are. And we haven't thought to do the observational work of just looking back and knowing what to ask. And preceding that is that we haven't done the work that we have needed to do to understand our own belief systems and where we've gotten that, and how what they've come from and how they affect people and race. And until we do that, we can't go any farther. We can't do the deep work that we need to do, because it starts here before we ever walk in the door of a classroom or see a teacher or head an organization. We have got to know that we are constantly checking our own belief systems, our own values, all of the things that we think. When we look at the situation that has been in front of us this past week, it has so had to do with people and the identity between Black people and violence. And that if you see Black men, especially at night, you ought to be afraid, because they may be doing something that is wrong. And we have to check as to whether or not, as Montessori teachers, do we hold that somewhere way down in there, so that when we see a child who is Black in the classroom, and that child is tending to be loud, or that child is tending to act up, are we responding to them more from a disciplinary perspective than we are from other people? Because way inside, we're holding this belief that Black people tend to be violent, and we want to catch it before that child gets out of control. It's like, that's the kind of stuff that we really need to be able to look at. That's the kind of stuff that perpetuates the kind of stuff that has been going on this week.
You know, Cindy, I so appreciate your discussion there, because it just reminds me that to talk about culturally sustaining as opposed to culturally responsive, that we have to be able to really understand the cultures that are in our school. So the observation piece, and John talks about this tons, about how important observation is within the classroom. I remember being a young, brand new Montessori teacher, and I was training, and I trained under Tim Selden. That how important observation was. And if I was really about it, he used to talk about going to your family's home, going to the homes of your kids and really learning who they were, and being curious. So being curious about who they are, as opposed to saying this is what's right, because this is how you expand who you are as a person. And then being committed to sustaining the culture that they bring to you and not eradicating it. When you talk about celebrating culture, what I really want us to move toward is to sustain and support the various cultures that come to us and recognize how important they are to the majority, to building Montessori, making Montessori better.
I think it's authenticity. That's what I think about. It's not, and want to, Cindy said this is, and you did about colonizing. We're not trying to come to, I will say that people sense it when you're not authentic. So there's coming in with that curiosity and knowing what your levels of judgment are so important, because when you're in a space that is different from your own, you may be uncomfortable, but if you're curious, you're going to be respectful and you're going to absorb and culturally sustain. And so I love that phrase, culturally sustaining. I'm going to use that.
Baiju first, John. Sorry, Baiju, and then back to John.
There's so much to talk about. You know what? I will go ahead and pass. Go ahead and there's just too many thoughts right now.
John, there is so much to talk about. Go ahead, John.
Well, just to link what Cindy was saying about that introspective work and what Val was saying about the observation, if I'm observing a classroom and I'm not asking myself the right questions, I'm still going to come to erroneous conclusions.
Hallelujah. Yeah.
It's like I'm going to say, well, this Black child is functioning this way. Therefore, it's like, well, where did that thought come from? Is that coming from my internal mindsets, or do I have any evidence to back that up, knowing this child individually, or knowing this child culturally, or knowing this child from a family systems? So observing is fine, but if we are not asking ourselves the right question, we don't know how to determine whether this is subjective information or real data.
Good point.
And Cindy, you had an example of, I believe it was an observation that you did of 3 children. Can you share that? I thought that was really helpful, and it really speaks to asking the right questions as well.
Sure. I was a part of a 3-day workshop in the South, and one of the things that we were asked to do was to go in and to observe children in class. And so I was in the classroom with one of the organizers of the workshop, and there were 3 children who were sitting on the rug receiving a presentation. I believe it was the stamp game, and one was a Black child, 2 white children. And the teacher was giving the presentation. She was done. The Black child looked like she hadn't quite gotten it all, and so she was looking a little confused. The teacher got up. The 2 white children looked like they had it. They understood. And so the teacher gave them 3 problems and said, okay, I want you to work these out. And so she got up and she left. And the Black child was asking questions. Well, how did you get there? Or how did you add these up? And the 2 white children were just talking to each other and working out the problems, ignoring the child who was Black. They worked out the 3 problems, and then they took the material, looked at the child who was Black, and said, you put it all away. And The Black child was upset and said, no, we all took this out, and so we should all put it away. And they said, no, you put it away. And the 2 white children got up and walked away. The Black child took one of the tiles and threw it on the floor. The teacher came over and disciplined the Black child for having thrown the material. And I thought there was something on many different levels that was missing here. There was the fact that the child hadn't gotten the information, that apparently she was looking at children with 2 different levels of understanding, or she wasn't checking in her presentation to ensure that everybody was getting it along the way. Her presentation was more, her body in the presentation was more leaned toward the 2 children who were on her right side, who were white, and not giving attention to the child who was Black. When she got up and gave the problems, the Black child was obviously not ready to continue with doing the work on her own, but the teacher left, maybe didn't notice that, but also didn't notice that the 2 white children were completely ostracizing the child on the other side, and didn't bother to have any kind of question when she immediately went over, saw all of the material still out, to the 2 white children gone to another area of the classroom, and the Black child sitting by herself. And there was no question in her mind that came out that said, what happened? Did something go wrong? Why are you the person who's left with all of the material? What frustrated you? She just disciplined for it. And when I called that out, I was told that it couldn't have been for that reason, that it couldn't have been racially motivated, that it had to have just been accidental, that it must have been that the Black child just didn't understand, and she had a problem with her own lack of understanding. And I thought that was just really unfortunate.
Yeah,
And I need to, can I just jump in?
Yeah.
I have seen that happen in so many different ways. It's the parents are calling me saying that there's something going on at school, parents of color. You go to the school leader and say, these are the things that your parents are saying. The school leader says, but that couldn't be here because we have a mission and we have a code of ethics. We have these, but it couldn't be here. So one is tying back to what John said, are you asking the right questions? The second is, do you have a real equity mindset to look at it and say, what am I seeing? And then the third is, we all need someone to check us. We need a partner in this work. Maybe it's another school leader or a consultant or somebody, but we can't do this alone. We all need someone. That's why as school leaders or as teacher leaders, we go into classrooms and check each other and say, well, how am I doing? Watch my lesson. I'll never forget doing the dot game was a monster for me, but I would have somebody watch me so they could see where I made my mistake. I'm also left-handed. So when I was doing the time frame, I was always getting kids backwards. I had to have someone watch me. So it's the same with this work. Any major work, it's nice if we have a tutor or a mentor to help us get through this. So consider that as well.
Thank you, thank you. We are we're really out of time. I'm not going to say we're just about, because we really are. But I have one question here that first of all, I've copied and pasted some of the questions so that we can bring them to the town hall, because the questions are still important. So even if we can't get to everything, obviously today, I would like to continue to address those. But we have Soraya Raffet, and says, hi, I'm so glad that you're addressing this important issue. I was really sick to my stomach when people were trying to, hold on, I'm going to just read it from here, sorry. When people were trying to relate these brutal actions to the coronavirus and not to racism, because people are stuck at home. So I have a problem with these people and I don't know how to address them. Could you please help me with this? Thank you, and I love you all. And I just think this is an urgent question. I think we've all heard this, right? Oh, it's because of the economy and it's because of, people have been stuck at home. And I think the question is, we all need, what's the answer? The answer is, this is racism. The answer is, enough is enough.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And the answer is, it doesn't have to happen. I mean, please help me with this.
But it's also not the first time this has happened. We've had the
Right.
60s. This is like this has happened before. It is enough is enough. And after there's a great title of one of the Washington Post articles that I read today, that African Americans are suffocating with America's foot on their neck. So America's had this pressure, and eventually it will explode. Remember, we talked earlier about the stress that African Americans or people of color in general have been under. At some point, it's going to explode, and it has nothing to do with COVID. It has to do with racial inequality and systemic racism.
I do think along those lines, I will say that that it's important to note that, you know, when a group of people are dying at twice the rate of the rest of as white people, not because of their race, but because of the systems that they are, the racist systems around them. I mean, how many times how can we fail? I always think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and I can say that, look, when I am in the Caribbean and I'm with my abuelo and in the hospitals down there and in St. Croix, it looks like nothing up here. And that experience, when these basic human rights fail you, I think that we have to say, you know, what are we doing in these pandemics? How are we preventing racism from impacting entire groups of our society? Like, those are the questions we have to ask ourselves. And that doesn't help answer, but there are so many articles out there to help people understand. I mean, what Cindy started with around, this is generations of people teaching us.
The one thing that I would say about, and it doesn't sound like this is the connection that this person has heard with COVID-19, but it has certainly been the case that there are an overwhelming number of people of color that are being affected by this virus. However, the response is not following the data. And,
right.
and so because of it, as the numbers rise, you have to also assume that the deaths are rising and the number of infected cases are rising of people of color exponentially. And so it's another example of how something is affecting people of color, and there is not a response that is equal to the need, that is equal to the challenge, that is equal to the disenfranchisement.
But I think also she is saying, I want to push back just a little bit, that some people are saying it would only happen because of COVID, that this would not have happened, that if George Floyd had died and COVID wasn't there wouldn't have been this outpouring. But I think it's just so many pieces, that it's not about COVID. It really is about all the times that this has been happening, that enough is enough.
There was a Rodney King.
Exactly. There was a 1960s. There was the Green Mountain Boys who were, Tim and I talk about this all the time. Back in 1960, this has happened. So and before that, but those are the ones I know about. Those are the ones I lived through. This is just an outpouring of what's been happening for eons.
Right, and how do we, you know, as some of you know, I struggled over the weekend and yesterday as I reached out to get help in writing this message to our community. And I really just, I think, what can we say that makes a difference? Because nothing's changed. And so, yes, there are changes, and it's incremental and it's small, and I don't know how we have the patience for that. I really don't. And when people say it needs a revolution or it needs action and movement, where do we go from here? And I know that's not a question to end.
Right. I have some ideas, and I know Cindy does too. So we're not short on ideas.
Right. It is the right question.
It's a perfect question.
Yeah, I think we don't have the patience.
Right.
I think that every single person needs to imagine that what happened to Mr. Floyd happened to your child, your brother, your mother, your father, and have within you that kind of feeling that will motivate you to do your work. I would say for anybody who says, gosh, I really don't know a whole lot about what has happened with Black people other than just slavery, then read. Devote 5% of your time to becoming educated and find out the information so that you can understand. Put yourself in the uncomfortable position around being around more people of color so that you can start to learn about more people of color. Demand your own self to examine your own biases and then teach the people around you. Don't put out teachers and be a silent bystander when you see things that are going on in the classroom or going on in your community that need to be said. You need to speak up. You need to demand policies and procedures and training in your school. And I don't just mean cultural celebrations where you have gumbo, enchiladas, and stir fry and think that you've done something, but that you really come to understand who people are, know all of the backgrounds of the children in your environment because you do them a disservice not to. Learn all of the backgrounds of the people who are on your staff, because just because they look like they're brown doesn't mean that they speak Spanish. Just because they're African American doesn't mean that they play basketball. It's like undo those things. I used to have a professor, and then I'll shut up. I used to have a professor who used to walk, I would walk into class, and every day the first thing that he would say is, how did you push back on racism today? That was my hello. How did you push back on racism today? And it walks with me, and it ought to walk with everybody.
Thank you, and please don't ever shut up. Sometimes you can take a pause to catch your breath, perhaps get a drink of water, but please don't ever shut up, Cindy Acker. Thank you. I just want to thank everyone. I know that we have, just scratched the surface on this conversation, and we'll continue it. We do have this town hall on Friday. We'll be sending an invitation out to the entire Montessori community. Please feel free to share the invitation with whomever you would like. It will be pre-registered, but everyone is welcome and invited to the conversation. You will be hearing more from us. You will be receiving some resources, and we will be, of course, devoting part of our news and announcements for more of these kinds of conversations and resources. Cindy?
It is my staff meeting. And so wherever your staff are, they can participate.
Yes, we have people who are inviting their staff, their parents, so it really is open, and it's perfect staff meeting, really. It just will start the conversation. Tim, final words from you today, my friend?
Well, first off, when we get to the bigger work, like John, I grew up as someone, the last generation went through the Holocaust, hiding every time someone would come to the door of the house, being afraid. It doesn't come close. There aren't words. We're not woke. We're all broken. The only thing that I can say that I think is important is that as imperfect as Maria Montessori was, the reason why she started this work was her intellectual and spiritual and heartfelt belief that humanity had only one possibility to save itself and save the planet. And it was her belief that the children would teach us, would help us to find a better way. And we're all on a journey, but we have so much to learn and so much to do. And the only thing that gives me hope is that while every one of us, every doctor, truck driver, everyone has a role to play, that those of us who choose to be involved with the work of child care, children, education, Montessori, not Montessori, we have our finger on the very pulse, as Montessori said. And together, I do believe that if the world can be saved, it's going to be through people like us together.
Beautifully said.
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, Tim, and thank you, everyone. I know we will regroup again on Friday. Well, we'll be regrouping every minute. We will be live again with this topic on Friday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. And we look forward to continuing the conversation. Please email us if you have things you want to get any questions. I will try to get questions into the chat as we regroup on Friday. From the bottom of my heart, my appreciation to each of you for being here, for engaging with us, for your patience and understanding with where we are in the journey and the process, because I will tell you, I have felt very honored, and I appreciate that. So thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Thank you.
Bye.